The Story of King Arthur and His Knights by Howard Pyle. Chapter 2nd. How King Ryence came to Camelot, and how King Arthur fought with the Duke of Northumber. Now upon a certain day at this time there came a messenger to the court of King Leodegrance, with news that King Ryence of North Wales and Duke Mordaunt of Northumber were coming thither, and that they brought with them a very noble and considerable court of knights and lords. At this news King Leodegrance was much troubled in spirit, for he wist not what such a visit might betoken, and yet he greatly feared that it boded ill for him. So on that day, when King Ryence and the Duke of Northumber appeared before the castle, King Leodegrance went forth to greet them, and they three met together in the meadow that lay beneath the castle walls of Camelot. There King Leodegrance bade those others welcome in such manner as was fitting, desiring them that they should come into the castle with him, so that he might entertain them according to their degree. But to this courtesy upon the part of King Leodegrance, King Ryence deigned no pleasing reply. "Nay," quoth he, "we will not go with thee unto thy castle, King Leodegrance, until we learn whether thou art a friend or our enemy. For, just as we are, certes, no such good friends with thee that we care to sit down at thy table and eat of thy salt. Nor may we be aught but enemies of thine until thou hast first satisfied our demands. To wit, that thou givest to me those lands which I demand of thee, and thou givest unto my cousin, Duke Mordaunt of Northumber, the Lady Guinevere to be his wife. In these matters thou hast in thy power to make us either thy friends or thine enemies. Wherefore we shall abide here, outside of thy castle, for 5 days, in which time thou mayst frame thine answer, and so we may know whether we shall be friends or enemies." "And in the meantime," quoth Duke Mordaunt of Northumber, "I do hold myself ready for to contest my right unto the hand of the Lady Guinevere with any knight of thy court who hath mind to deny my just title thereto. And if thou hast no knight in all thy court who can successfully essay a bout of arms with me, thou thyself can hardly hope to succeed in defending thyself against the great army of the knights whom King Ryence hath gathered together to bring against thee in the case thou deniest us which we ask." Then was King Leodegrance exceedingly cast down in his spirits, for he feared those proud lords, and he wist not what to say in answer to them. Wherefore he turned and walked back into his castle again, beset with great anxiety and sorrow of spirit. And King Ryence and Duke Mordaunt and the court of lords and knights pitched their pavilions in those meadows over against the castle, so that the plain was entirely covered with those pavilions. And there they took up their inn with great rejoicing and with the sound of feasting and singing and merrymaking, for it was an exceeding noble court King Ryence had gathered about him. And when the next morning had come, Duke Mordaunt of Northumber went forth clad all in armour and proof. And he rode up and down the field before the castle, and gave great challenge to those within, daring any knight to come forth to meet him in knightly encounter. "Ho!" he cried. "How now, ye knights of Camelot? Is there no one to come forth to meet me? How then may ye hope to contend with the knights of North Wales, and ye fear to meet with one single knight from Northumber?" So he scoffed at them in his pride, and none of them dared to come forth from Camelot against him. For the Duke of Northumber was one of the most famous knights of his day, and one of exceeding strength and success in arms. And there was now, in these times of peace, no one in King Leodegrance's court who was at all able to face a warrior of his approved skill and valour. Wherefore no one took up that challenge which the Duke of Northumber gave to the court of Camelot. Meantime many people gathered around the walls of Camelot, and gazed down therefrom upon the proud and haughty Duke, all bedight in his splendid armour, and all were grieved and ashamed that there was no one in the peaceful town to go against him. And all the lords and knights of King Ryence's court came and stood in front of the king's pavilion, and laughed and clapped their hands together, and cheered for Duke Mordaunt, as he so rode up and down before them. And the greater they were expanded with mirth, the more abashed were the people of Camelot. "Ho, ho!" cried that proud Duke. "How now? Will none of ye come forth to meet me? How then may ye of Camelot hope to face the kings of North Wales, and all his knightly array, in which I am but one man?" and the people of Camelot gathered upon the walls and listened to him with shame and sorrow. Now all this while King Arthur digged in the garden, but nonetheless he was well aware of everything that passed and of how that the Duke of Northumber rode up and down so proudly before the castle walls. So, of a sudden, it came to him that he could not abide this any longer. Wherefore he laid aside his spade and went out secretly by a postern way, and so up into the town. Now there was in Camelot an exceedingly rich merchant, by the name Ralph of Cardiff, and the renown of his possessions and his high estate had reached even unto King Arthur's ears at Carlion. Accordingly, it was unto his house that King Arthur directed his steps. And while he was in a narrow way not far from the merchant's house, he took off his magic cap of disguise and assumed somewhat of his noble appearance once more, for he was now of a mind to show his knightliness unto those who looked upon him. Accordingly, when he stood before the rich merchant in his closet, and when the merchant looked up into his face, he wist not what to think to behold so noble a lord clad all in frieze. For though King Arthur was a stranger to the good man, so that he did not know his countenance, yet the merchant wist that he was no ordinary knight, but that he must assuredly be one of high degree and in authority, even though he was clad in frieze. Then King Arthur opened up the breast of his jerkin and showed the merchant the gold collar that hung around his neck. And also he showed beneath the rough coat of frieze how there were undergarments of fine purple silk embroidered with gold. And then he showed the good man his own signet ring, and when the merchant saw it, he knew it to be the ring of the King of Britain. Wherefore, beholding those tokens of high and lordly authority, the merchant arose and stood before the king and doffed his cap. "Sir merchant," quoth the king, "I know that I am a stranger knight in disguise in this place. Nevertheless, I may tell thee I am a very good friend to King Leodegrance, and wish him exceedingly well. Thou art surely aware of how the Duke of Northumber rides continually up and down before the king's castle, and challenges any one within to come forth for to fight against him in behalf of the Lady Guinevere. Now, I am of the mind to essay that combat mine own self, and I hope a very great deal that I shall succeed in upholding the honour of Camelot and of bringing shame upon its enemies. Sir merchant, I know very well that thou hast several suits of noble armour in thy treasury, for the fame of them hath reached unto mine ears, though I dwell a considerable distance from this place. Wherefore, I desire that thou shalt provide me in the best manner that thou art able to, so that I might straightway essay a bout of arms with that Duke of Northumber. Moreover, I do pledge thee my knightly word that thou shalt be fully recompensed for the best suit of armour that thou canst let me have, and that in a very little while." "My lord," said Master Ralph, "I perceive that thou art no ordinary errant knight, but rather somewhat of extraordinary estate. Wherefore it is a very great pleasure to fulfill all thy behests. But, even an thou wert other than thou art, I would be altogether willing to equip thee with armour, seeing that thou hast a mind to ride forth against young the Duke." Upon this he rang a little silver bell that stood nigh to him, and in answer to its sound several attendants immediately appeared. Into their hands he entrusted the person of the king, bidding them to do him an extraordinary honour. Accordingly, certain of those attendants prepared for the king a bath of tepid water perfumed with ambergris, very grateful to the person. And after he was bathed in the bath, he was wiped with soft linen towels. Other attendants conducted him to a hall all hung with tapestries and embroideries, and at this place a noble feast had been spread ready for his refreshment. Here that lordly merchant himself ministered to the king's wants, serving him with various meats, and very dainty, and of several sorts, and likewise with fine white bread. And he poured him wine of various countries, some as red as ruby, others as yellow as gold, and indeed the king had hardly ever enjoyed a better feast than that which the merchant, Ralph of Cardiff, had thus spread for him. And after he had entirely refreshed himself with eating, there came 6 pages richly clad in sarcenets of azure, and these, taking the king an apartment of great estate, they there clad him in a suit of Spanish armour, very cunningly wrought and all inlaid with gold. And the like of that armour was hardly to be found in all the land. The chapon and the several trappings of the armour were of satin, and as white as milk, and the shield was white, and altogether without emblazonment or device of any sort. Then these attendants conducted the king into the courtyard, where there stood a noble war-horse, as white as milk, and all the trappings of the horse were of milk-white cloth, without emblazonment or adornment of any sort, and the bridle and the bridle rein were all studded over with bosses of silver. Then, after the attendants had aided King Arthur to mount his steed, the lordly merchant came forth and gave him many good words of good cheer. And so the king bade him adieu and rode away, all shining in white and glittering in fine armor. Wherefore he resembled the full moon in harvest season. And as he drave down the stony streets of the town, people turned and gazed after him, for he made a very noble appearance as he passed along the narrow way between the houses of the town. So King Arthur directed his way to the postern gate of the castle, and, having reached that place, he dismounted and tied his horse. Then he straightway entered the garden, and there finding an attendant, he made demand that he should have present speech with the Lady Guinevere. So the attendant, all amazed at his lordly presence, went and delivered the message, and by the Lady Guinevere came, much wondering, and passed along a gallery with several of her damsels, until she had come over above where King Arthur was. And when King Arthur looked up and saw her above him, he loved her exceedingly well, and he said to her, Lady, I have great will to do thee such honour as I am able, for I go forth now to do combat with that Duke of Northumber, who rides up and down before this castle. Moreover, I hope and verily believe that I shall encompass his downfall. Accordingly, I do beseech of thee some token, such as a lady may give unto a knight for to wear when that knight rides forth to do her honour. Then the Lady Guinevere said, Certes, Sir Knight, I would that I knew who thou art. Yet, though I know not, nevertheless I am altogether willing for to take thee for my champion as thou offerest. So, touching that token thou speak of, if thou wilt tell me what thing it is thou desirest, I will gladly give it to thee. And that be so, lady, said King Arthur. I would fain have that necklace that thou wearest about thy throat, for meseems that if I had that tied about my arm, I would find my valor greatly increased thereby. Pardie, Sir Knight, said the lady, what thou desirest of me thou shalt assuredly have. Thereupon speaking, she took from her long smooth neck the necklace of pearls which she wore, and dropped the same down to King Arthur where he stood. And King Arthur took the necklace and tied it about his arm, and he gave great thanks for it. Then he saluted the Lady Guinevere with a very knightly grace, and she saluted him, and then, straightway, he went forth from that place, greatly expanded with joy that Lady Guinevere had shown him such favour. Now the report had gone about Camelot that a knight was to go forth to fight the Duke of Northumber. Wherefore great crowds gathered upon the walls, and King Leodegrace and the Lady Guinevere and all the court of kings came to that part of the castle walls overlooking the meadow where the Duke of Northumber defended. Wherefore, so great a concourse was presently assembled, that any knight might be encouraged to do his utmost before such a multitude as that which looked down upon the field. Then, of a sudden, the portcullis of the castle was lifted, and the bridge nut fell, and the white champion rode forth to that encounter which he had undertaken. And as he drave across the narrow bridge, the hoofs of his war-horse smote the boards with a noise like to thunder, and when he came out into the sunlight, lo! His armour flamed of a sudden like unto lightning, and when the people saw him, they shouted aloud. Then when the Duke of Northumber beheld a knight all clad in white, he rode straightway to him and spoke to him with words of knightly greeting. Messire, he said, I perceive that thou bearest no crest upon thy helm, nor hast thou a device of any sort upon thy shield. Wherefore I know not who thou art. Nevertheless, I do believe that thou art a knight of good quality and of approved courage, or else thou wouldst not have thus come to this place. Certes, said I, said King Arthur, I am of a quality equal to thine own, and as for my courage, I do believe that it hath been improved as many encounters as even thine own have been. Sir Knight, quoth the Duke of Umber, thou speakest with a very large spirit. Nevertheless, thou mayst make such prayers as thou art able, for I shall now presently so cast thee down from thy seat, so that thou shalt never rise again. For so I have served better men than ever thou mayst hope to be. To this King Arthur made answer with great calmness of demeanour. That shall be according to the will of heaven, Sir Knight, and not according to thy will." So each knight saluted each other and rode to his assigned station, and there each dressed his spear and his shield, and made him ready for the encounter. Then a silence fell upon all, so great that a man might hear his own heart beat in the stillness. So, for a small space, each knight sat like a statue made of iron. Then, of a sudden, each shouted to his war-horse and drave spurs into his flank, and launched forth from his station. And so they met in the middle of the course, with a noise like unto a violent thunderclap. And lo! the spear of the Duke of North Umber burst into splinters upon the very truncheon thereof. But the spear of King Arthur broke not, but held, so that the Duke was cast out of his saddle like a windmill, whirling in the air and smiting the earth so that the ground shuddered beneath him. And indeed he rolled full 3 times over and over ere he ceased to fall. Then all the people upon the wall shouted with might and main, so that the noise thereof was altogether astonishing, for they had hardly hoped that their champion should have proved so extraordinary strong and skilful. Meanwhile, those of King Went's court ran immediately to the Duke of Umber, where he lay upon the earth, and they straightway unlaced his helm for to give him air. And first they thought that he was dead, and then they thought he was like to die, for behold, he lay without any life or motion, nor did he recover from the swoon wherein he lay for the space of full 2 hours or more. Now whilst the attendants were thus busied about Duke Mordaunt of North Umber, King Arthur sat his horse, very quietly observing all that they did. Then, perceiving that his enemy was not dead, he turned him about and rode away from that place. Nor did he return unto Camelot at that time, for he deemed that he had not yet entirely done with these enemies to the peace of his realm. Wherefore he was minded not yet to return the horse and armor to the merchant, but to keep them for a while for another occasion. So he bethought him of how, coming to Camelot, he had passed through the arm of a forest where certain wood choppers were at work felling the trees. Wherefore, remembering that place, he thought he would betake them thither, and leave his horse and armor in the care of those rude folk, until he would need those things once more. Now he rode away to the countryside, leaving behind him the town and the castle and all the noise of shouting and rejoicing. Nor did he once so much as turn his head to look back towards the place where he had so violently overthrown his enemy. And now you should pleasantly hear of certain pleasant adventures of a very joyous sort that befell him ere he had accomplished all his purposes. For, when a man is a king among men, as was King Arthur, then is he of such a calm and equal temper that neither victory nor defeat may cause him to become either unduly exalted in his own opinion or so troubled in spirit as to be altogether cast down into despair. So, if you would become like to King Arthur, then you shall take all your triumphs as he took this victory, for you will not be turned aside from your final purpose by the great applause that many men may give you. But you'll first finish your work that you have set yourself to perform, ere you give yourself ease to sit you down and to enjoy the fruits of your victory. Yea, he who is a true king of man will not say to himself, Lo, I am worthy to be crowned with laurels, but rather he will say to himself, What more is there that I may do to make the world the better because of my endeavors?